was killed at the scene. At least 3 other suspects are in custody, but authorities will not release any information about them or their role in the attack. Some of the country's top officials spent the day calling for calm and national unity, making statements from Capitol Hill, the Department of Justice, and, in the case of President Obama, from the NATO summit in Warsaw, Poland.
We still don't know all the facts. What we do know is that there has been a vicious, calculated, and despicable attack on law enforcement.
Today, we cry out. We feel the pain. We feel the hurt of the people in Baton Rouge and in Minnesota and Dallas and all across our country. But whatever we do, we must do it in an orderly, peaceful, non-violent fashion to help redeem the soul of America and bring us together to create what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called the beloved community. Because we all live in the same house.
Every Republican and every Democrat wants to see less gun violence. Every member of this body wants a world in which people feel safe regardless of the color of their skin. And that's not how people are feeling these days.
To all Americans, I ask you, I implore you, do not let this week precipitate a new normal in this country. I ask you to turn to each other, not against each other, as we move forward. Let us support one another. Let us help heal one another. And I urge you to remember, today and every day, that we are one nation, we are one people, and we stand together.
Both major presidential campaigns and their candidates canceled events today in the wake of the Dallas shooting. Donald Trump canceled his speech in Miami, Florida. Hillary Clinton postponed a campaign event scheduled for today with Vice President Joe Biden in Scranton, Pennsylvania. We're going to be covering this story from a lot of different angles tonight, but let's start with this, Mark. Big question. Besides it being absolutely horrible, depressing, and sad, what do you make of what this tragedy is all about?
This is a challenge unlike any I remember for the country. Obviously, we've seen incidents where police have shot African Americans. We've seen situations where police officers have been killed. But the proximity of these events this week, the 3 horrible days for 3 cities in the country, and the nature of particularly the incident in Dallas, the biggest attack on law enforcement since 9/11, it's a testing for the country. And I'll tell you, I always try to be optimistic. I'm optimistic, although there have been some voices that have been discordant. I think you're seeing an opportunity for the country, unlike we've had since 9/11, to really, really come together.
Yeah, this is a particular kind of a test, it seems to me. You know, we have, over the course of the last 25 years in our politics, when polarization has been, you know, the watchword and the defining feature of our politics, so we've fallen into this very easy way of talking about almost every controversy that happens in the country. You're on the red team, you're on the blue team, you're on one side or the other. This is one of these instances where the challenge for the country, and we'll talk about the candidates later, but for the country is to be able to have a conversation about this and address these issues by taking off the jerseys and starting to think about how, given we had black victims this week, we've had white victims this week, how do we have a conversation about the relationship between police and the communities they serve that is not riven by the kind of knee-jerk polarization that just marks way too much of our conversation?
And on the most human level, the reality that every American has to think about now is if you're a police officer or the family of a police officer, an African-American family, you leave the house, you have to worry about being killed. You have to worry about being shot. That is a reality for lots of Americans in both those categories, and every American needs to think about that and how to deal with it and how to respect all the implications of it.
A challenge not only to transcend polarization, but also a challenge to kind of try to actually adopt a posture of empathy and to kind of understand the fears that a lot of Americans, mostly black Americans, but that a lot of Americans, not all black, feel every day as they try to go about their business.
Yeah. All right. As we mentioned, unfortunate bit of timing. President Obama is at the NATO summit in Poland, where he did address the Dallas shooting earlier today at a previously scheduled event. He's about halfway through a trip now that takes him from Poland to Spain. The trip is supposed to end on Monday. No one would be surprised if he came home early, however. In his remarks this morning, the president made his second somber statement in as many days related to gun violence in America. 12 hours earlier, he told reporters that Americans should be troubled by the Minnesota and Louisiana shootings by police, which he called, quote, symptomatic of a broader set of racial disparities that exist in our criminal justice system. John, the president, as I said, currently overseas, but whether he comes back early or not, if he wants to do more than speak out the way he has, what more could he do now?
Well, as you know, Mark, the president has put forward, with a task force, has put forward a bunch of recommendations about community policing, about body cameras for cops, a bunch of other things that would try to bring greater police accountability, but also make some steps towards improving the relationship between communities and the people who police them. That set of proposals, I think, are quite sensible, but they seem to have gone nowhere, despite the fact that there's been a fair amount of bipartisan interest in them. So, the president has always felt that gun control is very important, and trying to get new gun laws on the books, that is probably impossible between now and the end of his term. But he could raise some of these policing issues to a higher level and make those central in terms of his domestic agenda between now and when he leaves office.
I'd like him to fly straight to Dallas and do an event with George W. Bush. If Donald Trump weren't the Republican nominee, if it were Mitt Romney or someone like that, I could easily imagine an event with lots of people, including the Republican presumptive nominee. I don't think that's in the cards, but an event with George W. Bush, I think, would be fantastic for the country. He, of course, from Dallas, lives in Dallas now. But there needs to be something that is bipartisan, if not Bush, perhaps Paul Ryan, something that shows that people agree on so much here, and to try to keep it from being just a strictly partisan, polarizing series of events.
Right. Criminal justice reform, as I sort of suggested and as you did just now, criminal justice reform has, at least in theory, got a lot of adherents who stretch from the far right to the far left. You've got the Koch brothers, very interested in trying to do something about penal reform. You've got people like Rand Paul, obviously a lot of people on the left who are interested in trying to make some progress in these areas. And there's surprising agreement and overlap on many of the things that people think would be sensible areas of reform, as I said, both in terms of mass incarceration, also in terms of how police do their business. One way or the other, trying to force those people to move beyond talking and towards some kind of getting something actually on the books seems important to me. All right. Both major presidential candidates, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, canceled events today after the shooting in Dallas. We'll talk more about how they reacted to the news right after this.
Welcome back to Philadelphia. We've seen Donald Trump respond to a few tragedies in this presidential race already, but his reaction to what happened in Dallas today was in some ways unlike any we've seen from the presumptive Republican nominee so far. This morning, Trump canceled a planned speech in Miami that was going to be titled Succeeding Together, put out some tweets, and then a statement saying that his thoughts and prayers are with the victims' families. Trump's soothing and optimistic, longer written statement said in part this, quote, "We must restore law and order. We must restore the confidence of our people to be safe and secure in their homes and on the street. The senseless, tragic deaths of 2 motorists in Louisiana and Minnesota reminds us how much more needs to be done. Our nation has become too divided. Too many Americans feel like they've lost hope. Crime is harming too many citizens. Racial tensions have gotten worse, not better. This isn't the American dream we all want for our children. This is a time, perhaps more than ever, for strong leadership, love, and compassion. We will pull through these tragedies." According to some news reports, first in the New York Daily News, Trump tried this morning to convince the New York Police Department to let him visit with some officers, but his request was denied by the commissioner, Bill Bratton, who told reporters, quote, "Our interest is staying out of the politics of the moment and not to provide photo ops." Meanwhile, Hillary Clinton postponed her campaign rally with Joe Biden in Pennsylvania this morning. She's expected to speak shortly here at a church conference in Philadelphia. This afternoon, Clinton did a series of TV interviews and said progress needs to be made on police outreach to communities across the country.
This is the kind of call to action, and as president, I would implement the very comprehensive set of proposals that I've been making for more than a year, including we must do more to have national guidelines about the use of force by police, especially deadly force. We need to do more to look into implicit bias, and we need to do more to respect and protect our police. I'm going to be talking to white people. I think we're the ones who have to start listening to the legitimate cries that are coming from our African-American fellow citizens. And we have so much more to be done, and we've got to get about the business of doing it. We can't be engaging in hateful rhetoric or incitement of violence. We need to be bringing people together. We are, unfortunately, in the grip of some very divisive and hateful rhetoric. And I think that that's a broadly shared view. Well, I think our tone has been very careful.
So Clinton's done some interviews. She's got this public event that she didn't cancel. We've yet to hear from Trump on camera. So, John, lots more to come from these two on these important and difficult issues. But politically speaking, what are the responsibilities, the opportunities, and the dangers you see for both Trump and Clinton in the wake of this horrible week?
Well, luckily, I think the responsibilities and the opportunities line up perfectly. Most of the country right now does not like Donald Trump, and most of the country does not like Hillary Clinton. They are both have very high unfavorable ratings in the country. Part of the reason for that is that this campaign has been conducted in kind of the most puerile and infantile and insulting way possible, not at all up to the kind of challenges the country faces across a range of issues. Now we have a major national trauma going on that challenges these candidates to raise their game, raise their level of rhetoric, raise their level of substantive response. If they do that, they can benefit politically. If they don't do that, or worse, if they try to in some way cynically profit from this and exacerbate tension in the country, they, I think, will both be irresponsible and they will suffer politically if they do that.
Clinton has an edge here in performance simply because she's dealt with many of these issues before in Arkansas and earlier in the campaign, particularly dealing with issues of gun violence against African Americans. Right. But Donald Trump's statement, again, as I said, unlike anything, 80% of that statement could have been put out by Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama. And it's going to be interesting to see when he starts to speak, whether it's in interviews or an event, does he echo the sentiments, the tone of that statement that for him was uncharacteristically conciliatory and dealing with a broad range of concerns. He has not spoken out up until now, as far as I know, very much about the two deaths earlier in the week. So he's got a lot to catch up to in terms of Hillary Clinton, particularly after what she's already spoken out today in those interviews.
Right, and as you know, she spent a lot of this winter traveling around the country with the mothers of the movement, the mothers of people like Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, others. She's got a lot of practice at talking about some of these issues. He does not have as much, so she has an advantage here for sure.
Yep. All right, we're waiting for Hillary Clinton's speech here in Philadelphia, but up next we're going to be joined by the former Democratic mayor of Dallas, Ron Kirk, also a former U.S. Trade Representative and a friend of President Obama's. We'll talk to him about the tragedy in his hometown when we come right back.
Joining us now from Dallas, the city's former two-term Democratic mayor, first African-American to hold that office, Ron Kirk. He's also the former U.S. Trade Representative under Barack Obama. Ambassador Kirk, thanks for being with us. You were mayor of Dallas from 1995 to 2002. Tell us what you know from your time when you were running the city and then afterwards. Just tell us about the state of relations between the community and the police force.
Well, Mark, first of all, thanks for giving me an opportunity to join you. What's really just a horrifically sad day for our city. And I have to say again, even though I've said it many times, but I can't say it enough, how much I hurt for and are sending my prayers to the families of those incredibly brave law enforcement officers who were executed last night. You know, being in the unique position, I guess, of both having been privileged to serve this city as a mayor, but also having been a man of color who grew up in the segregated South. I have so many conflicting emotions about what happened. Not a conflict in terms of the cowardliness of the act, the lack of rationale behind it. But our first responsibility as public leaders, whether you're a mayor, a commissioner, the president, a governor, there's nothing that is more central to our work than to keep those whom we serve safe. And so that was always at the forefront of what I did. And I considered myself fortunate, frankly, Mark, during my almost 7 years as mayor, that we had reasonably good and very, very positive relations between our police and our communities, and particularly our communities of color. Dallas was one of those cities that very early believed in community policing, invested in it. You're not always going to get it right, but I'd like to believe one of the things that's helped us get through some of the difficulties you're seeing in other cities is that we kind of made that down payment on that. And we are a city, as our mayor said during the prayer vigil, earlier that has learned a lot and embraced the challenge we confronted after what happened here 50 years ago in terms of President Kennedy, to try to become a more inclusive community. We're not perfect, but it's a great place to live and work. And what happened here last night is no reflection of the goodwill, of the faith of the overwhelming majority of people who live here.
Ambassador Kirk, the hashtag Dallas Strong is already being used, and you've got an incredible city and a strong city.
Mark,
I'm just wondering, though, and just...
Earpiece keeps falling out. I'm sorry. Can you say that again?
Okay. Yes, sir. I appreciate you joining us and love your city and know how strong it is, and have seen the hashtag already, Dallas Strong. But I'm just wondering your sense of how the community is dealing with this. Is there shock? Is there anger? What is the sort of sentiment of the folks there about what has happened and what needs to happen next?
Well, you know, I know it's inevitable. I would love to say it won't come. There isn't as much anger right now. There is just a collective sense of horror and shock that something like this could happen in our city, and particularly because, like other cities, we have had a number of protests over the last several years where the public and people of different faiths and different communities have expressed their concerns over the violence against young African-American men by some police, whether it was in Baltimore or St. Louis or others. But those have been peaceful protests. And there is an anger, but mostly because the fact that last night, by all accounts, was a very peaceful protest. The police got incredibly high marks from everyone that I spoke with that was involved in that because of their professionalism, their courtesy. I mean, people talked about the police took selfies with the marchers. They weren't in riot gear. You know, in one sense, if there is a silver lining, it was a wonderful manifestation of what good police works looks like. And then we had this ridiculous, horrible tragedy that wiped away all of that, including what needs to be a very legitimate conversation about what bad policing looks like in terms of what happened in Baton Rouge and Minneapolis. But I think there's, you know, right now it's still very raw, as you could imagine, Mark, and just an collective sense of sorrow and hurt among the city.
Ambassador Kirk, let me ask you, Hillary Clinton has said today that she thinks one of the things that needs to happen is for there to be national standards applied to police forces, particularly when it comes to the use of force. Do you think that's a good idea? And if you do think it's a good idea, how much do you think that would do to help reduce the incidence of things like what happened in Baton Rouge and Minneapolis?
You know, we can look, having been a mayor, the one thing, the great thing about being a mayor is that we will steal anything that works. And there are great examples of how to do this and do this right. And, you know, maybe we have those national standards. And I've seen a lot of your experts throughout the day from the law enforcement community talk about how much could be avoided, like what we saw happen in Minneapolis, by the proper training on the upfront. And we need to do that. But we also need to have a conversation, and an honest conversation, of how we stop talking past one another and engaging in what I think is a very non-productive conversation about whose pain is the deepest. Is it the black community because of the wrongful termination of life for our boys? Is it the fear in the police community? And we need to begin to do, as I think I heard Charles Blow articulate beautifully say earlier, let's talk about the one thing we all want. What we most want is for these people to come home safe. And so, yes, we know what to do. There are plenty of good examples and teaching lessons on how to do great police work. We've done a lot of that in Dallas under the leadership of Chief Brown. But it's also time for our leaders of both parties and of all perspectives to realize that words matter. And as our mayor says, we need to be careful how quickly we respond to all of these tragedies, understand the rawness of those emotions, and be a little more thoughtful on both sides when we respond, and try to talk to one another instead of past one another.
Right. Ambassador, let me ask you this question, Ambassador Kirk. I know you're a friend of President Obama's. Obviously, you served under him. But do you think he's done enough to advance that conversation?
Well, I think the president has been a wonderful role model, and I before I came on air, I probably had as strong of a conversation with one of my closest Republican friends who I reached out to express my frustration at one of our state leaders who led the effort, ironically, to pass open carry and to do everything he could to not even have us have a conversation about the difficult position that we put police officers in a state that wants everybody to be armed and walking around carrying guns. And he had the unmitigated gall to somehow blame the protesters for what happened last night. And my friend's response was, oh, this is somehow President Obama's fault. The president, through his calm, through his personality, has done more to try to advance civility in our discourse. But I don't think we can escape a conversation about the efforts to dehumanize this president, to do everything but recognize him and the corrosive effect that it has.
Ambassador Kirk, we gotta go. Thank you so much for being with us. We're really grateful to have you. Up next, what the Dallas shooting means for the Black Lives Matter movement and more. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to Philadelphia, where we're waiting for Hillary Clinton to give her remarks at the Convention Center about the horrible events of this week. Joining us now from Princeton University, back again today. We appreciate his joining us. Eddie Glaude, a professor of religion and African American studies and the chair of the Center for African American Studies at Princeton. Professor, thank you for joining us again on another tough day for the country. President Obama called you from Europe and said, I'm here in Europe. What should I do to help? What should I do to lead? What would you ask him to do?
Well, I would ask him to speak to the entire country, to talk about the enduring legacy of hatred and bigotry and how it manifests itself in the lives of not only African Americans, but in the sorts of reactions, violent reactions that we just recently saw in Dallas. What I found so strange about his press conference, Mark, was he wasn't speaking to black people. We know all the stats that he cited. And let me be very clear. He said there are some citizens, Americans, who feel that they're mistreated. We don't feel that we're mistreated. I mean, it's evidentiary. It has an evidentiary basis. We know we're mistreated. And he seemed like he was trying to convince white America to take seriously something And so I want to say that first. And then the second thing I want to say is that my heart goes out to the families of those police officers who were killed. And I hope that as a nation we can find the grace and dignity to not only extend our sympathies to them, but to begin to think about the way we live, that it's no longer sustainable. That we've created this. Yep. It's our responsibility.
Amen. Amen.
Let me ask you this, Professor Glove. Let me ask you about.
Sure.
I'm thinking about the road that we got here. If you think about, Ferguson and Eric Garner and Baltimore, the Black Lives Matter movement arose out of that. In some ways, it seems as though, even though there was a big reaction to some of those things, not much has changed. So what will it take to bring change?
In my work, I talk about we need a revolution of value. We need to change our view of government, which means we need to change our demand of government. I think we've lost a robust sense of the public good, that the idea of self-care is this kind of isolated individualism in which we all just pursue our own self-interest, which can lead to a wild, wild west culture. So I think we need to change our view of government, change our view of ourselves. I think we need to change our view of black people, which means we're going to have to change our view of white people. That is to say that we're going to have to come to terms with the reality that because one's white, it doesn't accord you any kind of specific privilege. And then lastly, we're going to have to change what ultimately matters. And we're going to do all of this, I think, by the activism in the streets, John. I think that has to continue. We have to make each other uncomfortable so that we can imagine together what a more decent society might look like, what it might be. I think it's going to take place at the polls. We have this amazing, you guys have been talking about it in such wonderful and brilliant ways. We have this amazingly complicated election season, where both choices make you want to throw your hands up. And I think folk are going to show at the ballot box in a variety of ways that they're dissatisfied. And I think we're going to see more struggles in the courtroom and in the workplace. I mean, we're standing on the precipice. And I think all Americans, all of us, need to double down and do the work requisite to imagine a new way of being in the world. So I think a revolution of value, and that's an echo of Dr. King's words in 1968, where do we go from here, where he called for a revolution of values. We need to fundamentally upend a way of life that isn't sustainable. It's no longer sustainable. And let me say this, thin imaginations will seal our fate. We have to be bold in how we think about the future.
You said this morning that the country was a country on edge and that we were a powder keg.
Yeah.
I'm curious of what you think the stakes are here, that if change doesn't come in a relatively expeditious way, what could happen? Be a sociologist for me here a little bit.
Oh my goodness, a sociologist? No.
Well, sorry, I didn't mean to. I didn't want to be demeaning. Let's be a future. You can be a futurologist. How about that?
I have to go home to my wife, and she's a sociologist.
Okay, well.
I think the stakes are high. Look, it's no longer the current levels of economic inequality aren't sustainable. The idea of locking black and brown people up at the rates that we do and allowing police to kill them in these ways isn't sustainable. The fact that we have failed public education isn't sustainable. We can't bomb people around the world into oblivion. That isn't sustainable. In other words, that the very fabric of our society is at stake in this moment, not in the near future. And I know Time magazine, which I write for all the time, has said that Americans are optimistic about our future. But I think if we drill down in that data, we see that we know that there's some choices in front of us, and that we have to make those choices today, all of us. And so the stakes are high. I think, that we actually have in our hands the responsibility of saving the prospects of achieving our country. And that's going to require some hard work, no easy answers, and we can't fall back on the myth of American progress we're going to have to look as I said yesterday, we're going to have to look the ugliness of who we are squarely in the face if we're going to do this work.
Professor Glaude, we have less than a minute. Just give me a few thoughts of what you think parents should tell their young children, teenage children, 20-something children this weekend about what they should think about what's happening in America.
You know, I just wrote a piece with my son that was just posted on time.com. We exchanged letters about this situation because I was so overwhelmed and worried about him. And the thing that I can only say is that, well, we have to understand that it's in our hands. Nobody's going to come save us. We have to do this work. And our children and our children's children will have to muster up the courage to step outside of their narrow silos and to see human beings right in front of them as the creations of God, of the Creator himself, and are worthy of dignity and standing. We have to do this on our own. We have to step outside of the ugly inheritance that frames us and binds us. And hopefully, prayerfully, we can achieve our country.
Professor Eddie Glaude, thank you so much for joining us again, helping everybody talk through this very, very tough stuff. Thank you. We're still in Philadelphia, still waiting for Hillary Clinton's speech. But coming up, our Reporters Roundtable here in Philadelphia while we wait for Hillary Clinton right after this. And if you're watching us in Washington, D.C., you can listen to us on the radio at Bloomberg 99.1 FM in Washington. We'll be right back.
Holy so he turned around trying to shoot at him, he got hit, boom, fail. Ran up, boom, 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 boom.
It's just a shock to these families, but they're proud at the same time, and they know that the city is grieving with them.
It has got to be so eerie to be near that West End in downtown Dallas at a lunchtime hour when you'd expect a lot of activity.
Always so busy.
Yeah.
We almost joke that, is this what it takes for us to have to come together? Does it always have to be a tragedy? Does it always have to be murder? Does it always have to be terrorism? Does it always have to be that hatred forces us to love?
And to the citizens of Dallas, this is my hometown. I'm a third-generation Dallasite. Homegrown. Big D. I
I want to say thank you to all of you for your show of support today. We feel this today. This is something that you've shown us that you really do care. So thank you so much, and Godspeed. Godspeed. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Those are some of the sights and sounds from the past 24 hours on Dallas news programs and social media. Joining us now from the Philadelphia Convention Center, where Hillary Clinton is speaking this evening, Bloomberg senior White House correspondent Margaret Talev, who's been covering the Democratic side of this presidential race, and MSNBC political correspondent Casey Hunt. Thank you both for being here today. Casey, let me start with you. Just give us a sense of, from this morning when you woke up until now, what you've seen of how the Clinton campaign has reacted to this moment of national tragedy and trauma.
Privately, behind the scenes, John, I think this has been one of the more chaotic days on the campaign trail, even though you really didn't see any of that in a public-facing way. Instead, you've seen the first time that Hillary Clinton was out in public was this round-robin of interviews that she did with all of the networks, and that was after a lot of back and forth on whether or not she should still campaign in Scranton. I mean, as early as 7, 8 a.m. this morning, that event with Joe Biden was still on, although they canceled a fundraiser with him pretty much immediately. Since then, they've tried to move the timing of this speech up because they wanted to make sure that she did have a chance to speak to the public. That, of course, has been, we're still waiting on that speech to start. It was originally, of course, supposed to be at 6:30. And then since then, obviously, we saw her out in those interviews giving a very measured response, trying to address both the criminal justice side of this and also trying to acknowledge the deaths of the police officers in Dallas.
Margaret, not many reporters have followed Barack Obama as closely as you have over the years. Just give us a sense of what you know or what you think the White House is thinking about how to meet this moment.
Of course, the president began his day in Poland. He's trying to have this NATO meeting with world leaders, and this has become sort of the worst, most painful part of his presidency, whether it is police abuse of power toward African Americans, whether it is a mass shooting of school children, whether it is any of these mass tragedies that have been haunting him throughout his presidency. He's been unable to move the needle on gun control. He has been unable to unite the country. He has these sort of episodic gains, and then they're washed away by another tragedy. And right now, he's really trying to figure out on 3 levels what to do for the country, how to talk to Black Americans about how to process their own anger at what happened in the previous 2 shootings earlier this week before this, and finally, as the leader of the Democratic Party, about how to make this an issue that can bring voters together around the Democratic Party's principles and not give Donald Trump an upper hand.
Casey Hunt, that room you're in is quite something. John and I were over there earlier. We're going to come back after the program, but just tell people what the setting is like for this incredible, what's expected to be a pretty emotional speech from Hillary Clinton.
I think we are expecting a pretty emotional speech, and of course this is a gathering of the AME Church. It was founded by a slave, and of course Philadelphia has quite the place in U.S. history, so those 2 things together should be addressing this conference here. And I think, she has been very careful so far to talk about this in a very measured way. I think reflecting this kind of somber moment that the entire political sort of atmosphere has taken on today. But the fact that she wanted to come here and speak to this audience and make sure that this was something, a commitment that she kept on her schedule, I think tells you something about the way they want to approach the wake of this tragedy and kind of underscoring the importance that this African-American audience has for her. I think coming to speak directly to their concerns is pretty meaningful.
Yep.
I think
and Margaret, just give people... Go ahead.
I think Democrats in Congress have renewed this push for gun control, but Hillary Clinton is cognizant of the fact that if she is seen as turning this into a sudden push for more gun control, rather than talking more broadly about the issues like division, that she could play her hand wrong, that it could backfire on her. So she's trying to pace herself, take her time to grieve, to console, and I think we'll see President Obama in the next couple of days make those same decisions. Does he need to cut his trip short? Of course, he'll go to Dallas when the time is right. How do you talk about this in a way where you're not politicizing the issue overtly, but also trying not to lose the moment politically?
Margaret?
Margaret,
Casey?
go ahead, John.
All right. Margaret and Casey, stay with us. We'll keep this conversation going right after this break.
Back now in Philadelphia, waiting for Hillary Clinton's first public remarks about the horrible events of this week, including the tragedy shooting of police officers in Dallas yesterday. Rejoining us, Margaret Talv of Bloomberg and MSNBC political correspondent Casey Hunt from inside the hall where Hillary Clinton's going to speak. Casey, I asked you before to talk about the context of the event. Just talk, because people can't tell from this shot necessarily. Let's talk about how big that room is and how unusually large it is for Hillary Clinton to speak to.
I've never been in a room this big at a Hillary Clinton campaign event that I can recall. Sometimes she's spoken to groups like this one where it's an outside event and you are inside a convention center. But this room holds thousands of people. I had heard up to 10,000. There are many seats here that are still empty, partly just because the way the day unfolded, the Secret Service just hasn't had a chance to fill up all of the seats here. So they're encouraging people to move up to the front, and they've put off the speech a little bit to try and make sure that these seats are filled.
Yeah, a big cavernous room, though. Margaret, obviously projecting forward, we're headed into a weekend now, a summer weekend, and both these campaigns have to deal with this tragedy, set of tragedies, but also picking vice presidential candidates, convention planning, etc. What's your sense of how that balance is going to go into the weekend and into next week?
Well, from the White House's perspective and the president's perspective, what he needs to balance is whether to stay in Europe, how long to stay in Europe. Right now, he's scheduled not to come back until early next week. That may change. For the presidential candidates, it's absolutely a matter of giving enough space and enough respect for people to grieve and for the situation to unfold without being absent at a time when people want to hear, what are you going to do to bring the country together, and what do you think is the appropriate way to address this? And of course now, because what happened in Dallas came on the heels of these two other events in Louisiana and in Minnesota. There really are two issues. One is police, security, protecting law enforcement, automatic weapons, and the other is this other longstanding issue of, largely white police forces and African-American citizens who've done nothing wrong and their perception of safety. And as you can imagine, this really cuts across two different core constituencies, different groups of voters. The way both of these candidates, particularly Hillary Clinton, speaks to these two issues and these two sometimes disparate constituencies is going to be a real challenge in the coming days.
Margaret, I want to come back to something you talked about before about President Obama and one of his challenges, which is how to talk to the black community about what's going on in the country right now. You know, the things that he said from Europe have tried to frame this in a very rational, kind of contextual way, and I think it is, at least from what one reads, there are some frustrated quarters in the black community about that. How do you think he feels about that, about the difficulty of this particular moment in trying to speak to both of those audiences at the same time, white and black?
It really is difficult. Of course, as president, as the commander-in-chief, as sort of the head of law and order and the leader of all of the United States, he has to say immediately that what happened in Dallas is completely inappropriate, no matter how angry anyone was about anything, that it's not the appropriate response. But the problem in talking about this with many African-American voters is that their grief, the grief of the families and the communities in Baton Rouge, in St. Paul, and all around the country that have been through Ferguson, Baltimore, and all these things, that was the focus of attention. That's now been pushed aside. That's now been marginalized to have this other discussion about police and automatic weapons and law and order. The president doesn't want to pick a side, can't pick a side. They're not competing sides. It's not one versus the other. But in terms of the debate, the news cycle, and how Americans are viscerally reacting to this, these two parallel, sets of tragedies have become completely intertwined. And for him, among swing voters, right now there's his legacy, and he wants to preserve that. But he also wants to pave a good road for Hillary Clinton. He doesn't want his baggage, the way people feel about him and gun control, to get in her way. And he needs to balance that.
And I would add to that too. I think Hillary Clinton, you can see in these interviews that she's done already, and I expect we may hear something similar from her on stage. They clearly are aware that they're trying to make sure that they are speaking carefully and compassionately to both communities in this instance. And they know that while on the one hand they are trying to create calm, to create harm, to urge people to kind of come together, that her words risk inflaming either side if she's seen as taking one side over the other. So I think that's something that the Clinton campaign is acutely aware of here.
Okay, Casey Hunt and Margaret Talbot both there waiting for Hillary Clinton to speak, which will happen shortly, we're told. Thank you both, and we'll be right back.
We are here in Philadelphia, where Hillary Clinton will be speaking shortly. Mark, you've mentioned a couple times today that you think this presents her with a kind of Bobby Kennedy moment from Indianapolis in 1968. What do you think the likelihood is that she'll reach for that and get it?
I think she's going to do just fine. My guess is that her remarks will be emotional and very well crafted, and I think her performance will be fine. But it's such an important time for the country. President Obama overseas. She's now going to be filling something of a void for a lot of people. It's going to be fascinating.
Right. All right. Check out coverage of Hillary Clinton's speech tonight on BloombergPolitics.com. And next up on Bloomberg Radio, First Word Asia. Coming up on Bloomberg West, Lyft Director of Operations David Rust. This weekend, don't miss The Circus, our Showtime documentary series in conjunction with Bloomberg Politics, which is back on Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time and Pacific Time. We're taking the show to Cleveland to preview the Republican National Convention next week. Until then, or until Monday, sayonara.
I'm Taylor Riggs, and you're watching Bloomberg West. Let's start with a check of your Bloomberg First Word News. Authorities say an Army veteran killed by Dallas police after the slaying of 5 officers amassed a personal arsenal at his suburban home, killing bomb-making materials, bulletproof vests, rifles, ammunition, and a journal of combat tactics. 25-year-old Micah Scavier Johnson of Mesquite, Texas, was killed by an explosive device strapped to a police robot after hours of negotiations with officials. 10 states are suing the U.S. government over rules requiring public schools to let transgender students select the bathroom of their choice. The states include Nebraska, where the lawsuit was filed. In May, 11 other states sued the Obama administration over the same directive. And the State Department says the U.S. expelled 2 Russian officials in response to an attack on an American diplomat in Moscow last month. The man was attacked by a Russian policeman outside the U.S. Embassy. A State Department spokesman says the attack was unprovoked. Russia claims the man was a CIA agent and refused to provide identification. NATO says a deployment of troops in 4 Eastern European countries is an open-ended commitment that will last as long as necessary. NATO says it's tripled the size of its response force to 40,000. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,600 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. This is Bloomberg. Bloomberg West is next.
I'm Corey Johnson, in for Emily Chang, and this is Bloomberg West. So coming up, America reeling from a night of violence in Dallas. 5 police officers dead, 7 wounded and a robot-delivered bomb used to kill a suspect. We'll explore the complex role of technology in this escalating national tragedy. Plus, in Asia, it's a race for